rather. So I think that's it. Yeah, no, just one final point. Yes, it's V Rock Achiever. Our service designer says the answers to most of the questions we have do not lie within this room. And by that she means whenever we're talking about some of the challenges that we face, we need to look beyond our own preconceptions and talk to actually people who use and engage with the software. So yeah, just a little intro from our panelists and then just their position on the privacy versus personalisation discussion. Peter, are you happy to go first on that?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Hello again. I'm Peter Reid from Bath Spa University, and I guess I'm coming at this from the perspective of a librarian. I'm sort of between serials and systems librarian is my role as a small institution. And I guess my starting position, anyway, I'm keen to hear people's views, is that we ourselves as a university are a membership institution, just like the services, sorry, the membership services we provide access to. And my main interest is in making responsible and ethical choices on the users, in the user's interest when it comes to access management. Now that may be privacy. In terms of talking to students, I've done some focus groups and student interviews and asked this question on what do they think about what the university does with their data. None of them have read the privacy policy, but they did talk. Everyone said, I wouldn't say that they didn't think that university would be doing the same things that other services, membership services, they are social networks and that sort of thing. So the university brand, certainly they talked about the allure of the university and various images. And so I say kind of not exactly on the user's behalf, but on the user's interest in terms of access management. That's my position. There's a question, who is competing to own researcher identities, being put out there by a librarian called Roger Schonfeld. So that could be the services themselves. I think there's an issue of services that have a lot of personalization and they have a strong kind of identity service themselves in terms of the user account there. There's the idea of devolving it completely to the users in terms of consent mechanisms. I don't think we're there technically or organizationally yet or as a sector. So I think we're in a place where I think the library or the institution, the identity provider, is in that traditional place of an intermediary. So yeah, my interest is in preserving the place of trust students have, and at least at first keeping the data under our control. So I might have taken up more than 2 minutes there, so I'll finish there.
No, feel free to carry on. I think it's all valuable. So yeah, to jump in if you've got any questions. Sebastian, are you happy to go next?
Yes, I can. So my name is Sebastian Kohlmeier. I'm the Senior Manager for Program Management and Business Operations at the Allen Institute for AI. We're located in Seattle, Washington, and I work on an academic search and discovery engine called Semantic Scholar. It's a free and nonprofit service that we provide. And I won't go into too much details about what we do. You're welcome to check out our sites separately. But in terms of privacy and personalization, it's something that is super important to us. And given how much control a lot of the big players have over tracking activity on the internet. We try to do as much as we can that's within our control to make sure that user activity on our site is not shared with third parties where possible, that personally identifiable information stays with, including email addresses, stays within our systems, and that the services that we provide in terms of enabling, empowering personalized features, that information is not shared with any third parties. There is no. The nice part is, as we have the luxury of not needing to generate any revenue, so there's no advertising on our website. So, that helps to limit the amount of tracking that happens from that perspective. But this is something that's always front and center for us, and we try to be we try to be very transparent with our users in terms of what we do from that perspective.
That's great. I mean, Ganesh, do you have a view you have to share?
Yes. So my elevator pitch is as follows. Okay, so I'm a final year business management student at AIU, and I've been a Jisc student partner since March 2019. I want to begin by saying I'm very thankful for being able to take part in this debate, especially on a topic of such emerging importance. So what I would like to say is that my presentation draws on my experience as a library user and from the perspective of a student researching for assignments. So since starting my course, I had begun using academic literature, such as peer-reviewed journals and books, to make my arguments more substantial and balanced. However, I was not fully cognizant of how my data being used and how the university dealt with the publishers and databases, and when I, as a user, access these resources. So outside of academic settings, I frequently shared my email and phone number with organizations, but now, to a greater extent, I acknowledge there's a concern with what data I share. So the reading I conducted prior to this has informed me that universities are moving to federated access over traditional IP access. And I have to say, it's great being able to access so many resources from a single sign-on. For me, the issue is one of transparency and customization. Choosing what I share, I think it's kind of like a deciding factor in my use of single sign-on. Moreover, why and for what purpose my data is kept and passed on is something that needs education. And I think to solve these kind of problems, we need cooperation, and I have to ask what users want as well.
Ganesh, you done?
Yeah.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'd also ask Hannah, so the team at the University of Surrey, don't introduce yourselves, but if anyone has a question for anybody, I mean, I'm not Fiona Bruce and this isn't question time. I'm happy for people to have a discussion amongst ourselves. So Ganesh, well, here's a starting question for you so you've read about this, you found out more about it. Does what you've learned make you feel more or less uncomfortable, and why?
So is the first question for me, sorry, I had quite fragmented the connection.
Does it make you feel more uncomfortable in terms of the data that's being collected? And are you aware of what those implications might be?
Personally, yes, because I'm aware that some of the data is kept for up to 12 months. There can be attributes there that if you haven't read about them previously, because I know when you're accessing information, sometimes you click through, or you're using a service which you're not completely familiar with. So I am more concerned now, but I think that with things like GDPR, there is protection for users. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. And Sebastian, I'm going to kind of switch tack actually there, and just ask you, in terms of the data that you collect on your users, do you track search history? Do you track, do you go beyond sort of personal identifier and identifiable information and into actually behavioral information as well?
Yes, we do track behavioral information, but the way that we track it is we try to keep all of the information that we have about our users in terms of their email addresses and a user's name, first and last name, etc. Information that they've provided to us. Some of which is optional, by the way. You don't need to provide us with an email address if you don't want to. If you choose a login option that doesn't require an email address. We don't share that data with third parties. Instead, what we do is we actually have we hash a user ID that you can't trace back unless you know how to decrypt it. So that's one step that we take to protect the information that our users provide us. We do, if you are not logged in, then obviously your information is all anonymized. If you are logged in, we do collect information that users provide, but we're very explicit about how we then use that to surface recommendations. If users are telling us, that if users are rating papers, for example, we have a personalized feed. Then we use that information to tune their feed of research papers. But that's the only thing that we use that information for.
Do you, Sebastian, see that do you monetize that data? I mean, I think your business model might be quite pertinent in this. I mean, do you use that data to make money at any point other than sort of delivery of the service?
We don't. So we are fully funded by Paul Allen's estate. Paul Allen is a late Microsoft co-founder, and as a result, we have no need to generate any revenue. So we don't share any personally identifiable information with any third parties. The only thing that we will share occasionally is anonymized data. And I can give an example. We participated in a bias in academic search study that was part of a conference last year. We provided some anonymized search and click data to participants in the conference. So we do that type of thing when there is a good reason for researchers to use that data for the common good. Our mission as an organization is AI for the common good. So we focus we only share data in cases where that's the specific outcome that someone is looking for.
So it's a question for Peter and Hannah subsequently. But Peter, I mean, does the business model that the publisher or platform has, does that have any impact on your view on how the data is being used?
I guess there's that's an element, I suppose. I said in my talk earlier on about this idea of competing identity providers. I think universities increasingly want to use the data to optimize the student experience because we're under a lot of pressure to do that. We are subject more and more to market forces, perhaps even more so than Sebastian's organization, really. I mean, obviously, the benefit of personalization when it's with a third party may be passed on to our users, or it may not. It's just unlike Sebastian, and as was the University of Surrey's talk showed, we have to, in some cases, in order to provide the service, to give away some personal data for that. It's very likely that's going to be in the student's interest, but I think the example I pointed to was LinkedIn Learning, and LinkedIn Learning is going to be a fantastic resource in the situation we're in at the moment because there's a huge drive for remote and digital services, and it's an opportunity to demonstrate how valuable they can be. But I'd said in my talk they're a community of learners and a suite of learning resources, which is kind of a digital university in a way. It's a digital school, isn't it? It's and in that instance, the drive for personalization is so great to connect it to that social network that it's eroding the user experience. So that's not that benefit is not being passed on to the students in that respect. Only, I mean, of course, it's the student's choice to choose to link their social network account to their university account. But the thing is, the UX is such that it's very persistent. It's like, are you sure you don't want to? It's that kind of thing. You know, they're optimized for that, and they have a responsibility to their shareholders as a company. Of course, it's their right to do that. It's just, I keep making the analogy with a book. You know, it's almost like the books are kind of jumping off the shelves trying to get the user's attention. And I've never forgotten a presentation by an app developer who did a very, very cool app based on the TV series In the Thick of It. He gave a talk at a mixed digital conference at MassBar about digital storytelling. And he said something about the book itself being a perfected technology other than being a bit too heavy. So he didn't want personalization on his ebook. He was doing ebooks as well as these gaming interactive apps. He didn't want personalization. He didn't want things jumping out at him, certainly. And yeah, it's when it gets to that point where it's not in our reader's interest. And that would extend to things like buttons that say buy this prominently on the website when you're linking through to it. You know, we've already bought it, but there's still, you know, they're a website, so they're competing for attention. And that's an aspect of the World Wide Web which we're all in, whether we're a university, profit, non-profit, anyone, I think, who owns a website is competing for attention. That is your incentive in such a sort of flat system. So that's a bit of a torrent of thoughts. And again, I've forgotten your original question.
Also, I'd like to ask the team, sorry about that as well, but with specific reference to their experience with Retail Week. I think the question is, does the business model of the platform have an influence on the way you engage with that publisher?
Yes, I think the more personalisation there is, the more barriers it throws up to the students who are trying to access it. They want stuff, they want to be able to access stuff as quickly and as easily as they can. And when you're putting barriers like that in the way, that really doesn't help matters.
Yeah, we definitely get complaints a lot about ease of access to resources, and this is a step in the wrong direction for sure. And it is in the example we had with End Report. It was another. They sort of obviously felt they were doing right by saying we've looked at this ourselves with our internal processes, but the fact that they weren't willing to share those internal processes or tell us anything at all is a big worry, to be honest, because you just don't know, and it's that divide between you've got a duty to the student to provide them the resources they need, but you've also got a duty to protect their information that they've disclosed to you. So it does put us in a very tricky situation.
And what do you perceive the risks? How big are the risks of the students' data being accessed inappropriately?
Ooh,
Who
who
knows?
knows? As big as your imagination. No, I don't know. I don't know, to be honest. What does everyone else think? What's the real danger? What, are we worrying too much, or?
I saw a plenary session at a library conference in Australia, and the keynote there was talking about how use of data moves from something that powers insight and adds value to something that's almost becomes surveillance. And there's sort of there's a sinister aspect of, it's not necessarily related to the library, but the ability to track students' phones to know where they are. And then to be able to say, oh, we're concerned that might, the fact that you're spending a lot of time in this particular bar rather than the library might impact your outcomes.
Yeah, it's
So,
true.
Yeah, I mean, big companies have had a problem with this recently with the handling of people's data. So that's sort of always in the back of your mind, I suppose, with things like this. That's almost the worst case that could happen. It's a big unknown, to be honest.
well, and I think because it is an unknown, I think it's one of those areas where we do need some sort of ethical framework as when we look forward. So it's a question for everybody, and I think Phil, step in if I don't articulate this question in quite the right way. But who owns this data? Is the university email, is that the university's identity which they're owning on behalf of the student? Is it the student's identity? And is it, when that data gets passed over to Sebastian's platform, is it actually Semantic Scholar that owns that data? Does anyone have a view on that?
Good question.
Would anyone, I mean, so in terms of the discussions around, who owns those discussions around policy and governance, Peter, in your organisation?
Really, there's an information security manager called Martin Reynolds, who is very good at his job. And yeah, he's a very prominent voice on this. And it's frustrating, as I said, we're all subject to the same incentives to improve our services. So you want to get something up and it to work great. But GDPR, of course, is something that we're all subject to, that legislation. So, and he's very kind of good at kind of, you know, say very much questioning, should you do this before, like, yes, you can do it. So I don't think legally, I'm afraid I don't know in that to answer your question about, or to address your question, when it's passed over, who owns that. Once it's given away, I guess the consent has been given, and it's at that stage really when the choice has been made. Yeah, but I think GDPR puts it down to the user wherever possible, doesn't it? I think that's the.
I mean, Sebastian, do you have a view in terms of how you manage, own, and process that data? About once it's on your platform, where ownership lies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our view is that we own that data, and you know, one interesting thing, and I won't name any names, but we do have licensing agreements with content providers, including publishers that give us that enable us to index content, and we are pretty firm in those agreements that we own any of the analytics data, and that we aside from you know, high level summary usage information of that publisher's content, that we won't share you know, any of the analytics data with any third parties. You know, conversely, we don't have any use cases where we need to acquire user data, or where we acquire user data from third parties. So that part of the question doesn't apply to us. But we try to make it a point to ensure that we own the user data, and that we don't relinquish ownership to any third party.
Good. And Hannah, the team of, sorry, what's your view on that question of sort of ownership and governance?
We don't know. I mean, we also have a GDPR data specialist within the university who we probably refer to. I mean, deep down, I sort of feel like it's the students who own the data, because it's their information. However, legally, I wouldn't know.
Certainly, with when we've looked at GDPR things within the library, it's been very much, as GDPR states, you know, you only have as much data as you require, as is genuinely needed. You can't just take data for the sake of it, or what might be useful in the future. And we've been very keen to be clearing out any data as soon as if it's not relevant, or we no longer need it. But as for ownership of that data, that's still not answering that question.
I mean, Ganesh, do you have a view, not necessarily on the legal definition, but just from a sense of what's right or wrong? Who owns that data? Where does that final control sit? Was it the question? Did you hear the question, or was it just not well articulated?
If you could restate the question, that would be great.
For Ganesh, yeah. So Ganesh, in terms of as a student whose data is being used, but given to you by the library, used by you, but you also used by the publishers, what's your view? Who has the final say on how that data should be used?
Personally, I feel that before someone accesses a resource for the first time, even if they've used single sign-on before, there should be a kind of like a little sheet saying what things are your data, what are you actually transferring at each point of time, how much do you want to share. So it could be broken down into smaller areas, and once the data is shared, I agree, it is partly not the students anymore because they've entered into a bilateral agreement with someone else.
Right, okay. No, it's about the consent, transparency and consent.
What I wondered about, just responding to what Ganesh said, now I'm a librarian, but I never get to actually do the teaching sessions where, in your first year and maybe when you do your dissertation, you might have a librarian come into one of your lectures and introduce you to some of the systems. I think I've often had long had the idea really that it would be great if at that point the students could enter into a kind of discussion on the digital ethics of this, not just about how to use the resources, but I think you could take a more materialist approach really of like what is actually happening here when you log in, and that would be a way for me of teaching about this idea of data in society, data-driven services, privacy, ethics, which I think is one of the university's kind of cross-curricular priorities. So what do you think about a librarian coming and having this discussion when telling you about library resources?
I think that's a really good idea, but I think that when students reach university, they're all 18 for the most part. It's a formative experience for them, but at the same time they should be realizing that they kind of need to own their decisions. What things that, obviously education is really crucial, not just academic, but researching and things like that. But if they see the experience as formative, and they're learning about how to use resources like this, they're learning about data protection and how their data is transferred, they really should be engaging with it more themselves post a little introduction or a debate. It's something that they need to know themselves a bit more.
I don't know to extent that's becoming part of A-level curriculums and that sort of thing, but yeah, you said in your experience you were giving your email away to society promotions and all that sort of thing. But yeah, actually, university traditionally is that formative experience, and yeah, I'm just interested how these questions could be built into any curriculum, because all of them are going to be using third-party services. University courses, like I say, at the moment, because we're not doing campus-based teaching, so much of it is going to be delivered on third-party services. So increasingly, it's really, really relevant. It's just a way of talking about what we're doing while we're doing it, like not just the content of the curriculum, but like how are we teaching this? And it's yeah, it would be interesting for me to have that discussion. I quite like the idea.
I think it's an important discussion to have. I was at DigiFest with Jisc last week, and I had a brief conversation with the IT director of the University of Sheffield, who highlighted this as an area that needs to be better understood. So there are ethical concerns about how the data is used, and there is a feeling that there's a lack of clarity around who should own that conversation, if you like. But when you're talking about issues of policy and governance, which is not just a mixed community within scholarly communications with the UK, but it's also a global issue. Where that discussion and debate happens, I think is really important about who should be involved in that debate, and are there final decisions that be made, and do you forget about ethics and actually just focus on legal compliance?
If I could just sort of jump in there, just to pick up Peter and Ganesh's point as well about what a practical application of such a learning process might look like. So Scott Alberg from Reprint's desk earlier on sort of laid out the case for how many users will just turn away from content their organisation has sometimes purchased at almost the first opportunity. But then to take the learning curriculum that Peter just outlined, well, we're all used to giving consents on our mobile devices for various bits of data about us. But certainly at OpenAthens, we detect very limited, if not zero, appetite for institutions, because that's probably where the consent would need to be granted, for institutions to put up yet another barrier to say, okay, you're trying to log into this journal. Now, are you happy to, for example, pass on your email address, maybe your full name, surname, gender, area of study, what have you, which is basically called an attribute release policy. Peter at Bath Spa or Ganesh as a user, do you think there's appetite there or users would readily accept such an intervention on the user journey towards the content that they want? Obviously, this is a question for Surrey as well.
I can't speak as a student, obviously, although I do use the resources to find out stuff. So I guess I'm mimicking, having the same experience as a student in that case. I like the idea, I suppose, of the university or the library as sanctuary, and I can't get away from that, however conservative that might sound. So I think, as we know, as we go to any website these days, we'll have a cookies consent pop up every time, and that's good, I suppose. That's good in terms of the compliance and consent and that sort of thing, but it is an extra impediment to the user experience. I'm interested in what if the university could mark itself out as a place where this didn't happen. What would that look like? What would that look like if a university took the policy of, like, we're not going to do this, and you can have 3 years where this isn't happening, and you can just use your mind and you can think and read. And I'm just interested in how that would play, really, with a because I think that's what a university is supposed to be for. That's that time away. It's within walls, so to speak, and it's a unique time in your life. And yeah, an attribute release policy that asked for that information again and again and again would have to be designed according to certain principles, not so as not to be too intrusive, I guess. I do know Jisc. Again, I was at Jisc DigiFest last week too, and there was Jisc have got some personalisation principles, which are just good guides to how to do it well, so that it's not done in a creepy or intrusive way. And perhaps universities could really try to go with that in the same way as Sebastian's organisation could, because we're not subject to those incentives. And but yeah, over to Ganesh or any other students to in the audience for how they would feel about it.
From the Surrey perspective, when you're talking about when you do stuff on your personal devices, you're choosing to do that, but as a student, you're not choosing. It's completely different. You're often being told and directed what to use as part of a reading list, for example. So you've got to draw the distinction there.
Yeah. So I think to touch on personalisation there for a minute, and I think it's interesting if you think back all the way to the beginning of the day, which feels like a long, long time ago. But Sam from 67 Bricks was talking about how actually you can use that data positively to enhance the experience. I mean, Sebastian, from your perspective as a platform provider, and actually the universities as well, what are the core values that we can squeeze from resources by enabling personalization in a not creepy way?
Yeah, I can take that. I think the key the key value that we can provide as a platform when it comes to personalization is to enable students, researchers, and scholars to find relevant information for their research projects or in general for their research interests. If we can achieve that in a way that is not surprising to the user, right? The user has control over how they receive those recommendations, and they're able to influence and provide feedback. I think that's really important. The other piece that's really important, and this is something that we are working on as an AI research project, is being able to explain why we are recommending something. So being very explicit about the fact that we think that you should pay attention to these authors or these papers because these papers or these authors share a common set of topics. So being super transparent from that perspective enables, it builds a lot of trust with users.
And how do you facilitate that transparency?
We try to make explicit design decisions in surfacing recommendations that that enable us to incorporate those explanations into the interface, so that when users see something that's being recommended, we have a little snippet. For example, for recommended authors, we have a snippet that says these authors are recommended by our system based on a combination of citation data and similarity of papers. So that gives the user a way to understand why something is being recommended.
Okay, and then from an institutional perspective, what's the value of sort of personalizing the digital experience?
The value, I mean, in terms of the projects we've done where that's been the case, so within the virtual learning environment for the students, there's a page where it's got resources particular to them. I was involved in these projects. I guess it's just fewer, there's this idea of fewer clicks for the student. There's this idea of seamlessness. There's an idea of, as came from my colleague at the University of Surrey earlier, this that can seem like it's making things just easier for the students so that they don't have to think about how they're using resources. Going back to that talk you mentioned, John, from sorry, I can't remember the chap's name, but 67 Bricks, wasn't it? Yeah. He had a triangle, didn't he? And it was like building on foundations of kind of the basics was just kind of an information resource, and it was going right up towards almost predicting the future with so much data that you can really have a value-added service. I think as a librarian who's still, just trying to get the students to get the full text, the elusive PDF, into their hands when they click it, a bigger issue in terms of just benefit for the students from my perspective is at the moment the interchange of metadata standards between the different providers. So it's fine if all of the resources come from EBSCO and they were our only provider. That would be a smooth user experience in the same way as it's a smooth user experience if all your products are from Apple, that sort of thing. But it's just, we find in our discovery setup that very often it's not possible to get straight to that full text with the click. I think that's that's lower down the triangle, so to speak, but it's a foundation upon which we have to build. I think we jump too far ahead, perhaps. That's perhaps a risk.
Ganesh, from your perspective, I mean, are there benefits? What benefits do you see from having to be able to have digital services personalized?
I guess for growth, so you'll see more resources that you would probably want to click on. You might, but what I would want personally is, I remember when you used to use a sign-on such as Google, and then you went on your browser and you went through the information, the ability to go back and actually tailor or keep or erase all the information you've managed to put on. personally. I think like if the ability to moderate what you're sharing even afterwards would be really something that I would think would be very useful, but I don't know how it would work with more than one publisher. That is my take on that.
No, thank you for that. And there's a nice question that's come in from V, who's a colleague at OpenAthens, is what would happen if the student said no? How would that change the student experience if the student is not happy with releasing that amount of data?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yes, yes.
So it's not happened. It's not happened, but I think it would be a fascinating test case. Say they wanted all of their personal data erased from our platforms, we'd have to suddenly devote some of our resources to, our operational resources to a project, really, to look across all these providers and see which ones actually facilitate that in a one-click, one-button fashion, to sort of erase it all. I do know that in terms of the EBSCO personal account, if they're using EBSCO host services, that is possible, and they've got that set up, and that's fantastic. But we haven't done an inventory, to be honest. And I think it would create a sort of, we'd have to have a student to do it, to force us to do it. I think under GDPR, there is some kind of right to be forgotten provisions. So I guess we would have to respond to that. So it would be user-driven, really, Ganesh, that sort of thing. And maybe if we were educating more about this, you'd get more user-driven requests like that. Probably shouldn't share about this. There was a story in The Guardian about just how difficult it was to get all your personal data back from Tinder. Like, I think they do provide a service to do that, but it took them a long time, and then something comes back and it's like, is that everything? So yeah, I think it's perhaps not every provider is going to be set up for it.
Okay. Phil, are there any more questions coming in?
I'll mute myself. No more questions, although there is an interesting observation from I think possibly a publisher who's signed in, but saying once a student's data has been resold 50 times, it's difficult to know where it came from. The EU says data should be proportional, but if a publisher can't say why it's stored, which I think goes back to something that either Peter or the Surrey folk were saying, well then how can you know what's proportional? So yeah, so that's more of an observation than a question. And Peter interpreted V's question about not giving consent in one way, well, actually about withdrawing consent. And it's interesting because I interpreted the question a slightly different way. Is there where, for example, whether an attribute release policy interface existed or not? If the user, let's not call them a student, if a user declined to grant consent on their way into a product. Mm-hmm. Would they still get the same experience as somebody who granted consent?
I think that's the issue when we come to an attribute release policy for certain providers. I think, for example, RefWorks, a reference management piece of software, if you didn't want to provide a unique user ID for yourself, you wouldn't be able to use that service because it's completely personalized. It's kind of an application where you need an individual account in order to use it. We've got the situation with LinkedIn Learning at the moment is that you have to release email. So that would be an interesting case that we weren't given the choice, I suppose. So we'd have to have a conversation with someone from LinkedIn Learning and ask, can you just set it up? Otherwise, no. And I think I've heard from the University of West of England, a colleague there, that the information security officer there wasn't happy with the resources where you logged in. So it says you're a student from this university or user from this university and lets them in. But then there's a pop-up which has all of this information which you have to provide. Perhaps you don't have to. I'm not sure about that in the case of certain services, but that's that dynamic where the information is collected. If you don't fill out that form, you can't use the service. So it goes back to University of Surrey's presentation where they said, let's talk about this as a community, because it would have to start being built into contracts and the contractual discussion when we buy these in acquisitions. That's when, if this was built into that a bit more, then that, I guess that would be a market-driven change in that case. Yeah, but yeah.
What about, you said that university libraries could be sanctuaries. How could they be a sanctuary in terms of, if you wanted to make them efficient in the best way possible, you didn't want resources to be bought that weren't used? Envisioning that kind of reality and a lack of a kind of tangible monitoring. Do you understand what I mean? Is that actually something that you would feel is necessary though at that level? If you're 18, I don't know, up to 30, because for PhD, do you think it's necessary that they have complete sanctuary?
I wasn't. It was generally like a concept or an ideal, and it's just
Okay.
I was saying that I like that idea. In terms of how it could be achieved, it's really difficult, because a modern library, just with printed books, it needs to track those books in terms of who's got it out. It always has done, but it used to be done on cards and paper. Now it's done digitally. It's very true. It's not possible to run a modern library along those lines. It would have to be very much redesigned or going back to the card catalogue to do that. So it's a very good point you make. I was just talking about it sort of, what's the word, idealistically perhaps. There's a writer I really value, he's a technologist called Jaron Lanier, and he gave a talk at the New York City Public Library back in 2013. And he was obviously asked by librarians or people in the library users, public library users, various questions. And he said that he thought the library was just the one place, in terms of looking and browsing through physical books, when you're browsing them, at least, it's the one place you're not being spied upon. That was his words. And that's still true within a university. You can serendipitously, within a library, you can serendipitously discover things and you're not being tracked. But that's only true in the physical library. It's just an ideal to kind of keep in mind, I suppose. That's how I put that out. But yeah, it's a very good question, because practically, just like your question about pulling away all personal data from all our platforms, it would be difficult to implement, because we are a long way down the road of this, and it is certainly the society we're moving towards. Undoubtedly, we're you can't. It's going to be very difficult to turn it back. But Jaron Lanier again is a great one for talking about certain designs in digital media which he thinks are bad, and we still have the opportunity to talk about that and to try to develop better designs. He thinks social media is a bad design, what was called Web 2.0. He just says he thinks that's just bad technology, but the problem is it becomes locked in down the line once you've made certain decisions. And yeah, that was that kind of more philosophical point of view is where I was coming from.
Ganesh, I think
very practical.
Yeah, Ganesh, I think that's a really good point about the practical aspects of how to know where to invest. It's interesting that OpenAthens, as a technology provider in this, does have the ability to generate statistics which do drive insight. But one of the key things that we found is people like to be able to look at an aggregated data set across location or maybe role without needing to go through to the detail who actually is doing what. And actually you can still get very powerful insight from that top level view. So Phil, how are we doing for time? Is it got a couple of minutes?
Yeah, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and then we're into the Best UX Awards.
But they're interesting. I like the idea about the question of the community and who does what. I'd just be interested to hear just a kind of a quick answer from each panelist, including from the University of Surrey. I know University of Surrey posed the question, but who should be taking the lead on this?
I think the library should take the lead. I'm going to say that. I always think we should. It's not hard to do, but I just think, yeah, I like empowered librarians, and I like us having a voice. I think we do things well and diligently, and I would like to see. I'd like to see the library taking more of a lead on these issues. Certainly, yeah.
Sebastian?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, no, sure. It's, as we have the discussion around what's, how do we balance privacy versus personalization and utility, who should be taking the lead on that discussion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In some ways, I think it's public institutions that should take the lead on this. We are, and governments. We are already seeing a lot coming out of with GDPR and the California privacy regulations that were passed earlier this year. I think that having that type of legislation and those protections in place really helps provide some guidelines and some rules of compliance. So that's where we stand from that perspective.
Great. Ganesh, do you have a view?
Yes, I think it has to be coordinated. It can't just be the library or just the university or just students. I think one of the best things you could have is what Peter said. It would be kind of like a modular system of teaching students and librarians instructing as well, to see if they could understand what is being shared, what isn't being shared, whether they're comfortable with it, and if they did want to reject not single sign, if they did feel like they wanted to pare back the information they could transfer, or they wanted to kind of collectively bargain to say, we don't want to do these things, or we do. Having that voice for students, librarians, or even the university or the different arms could be very profound.
Thank you. And then finally, I mean, Hannah, you posed that question. What's your view?
Yeah, we just had a little silent conference about it to see what we think. I think we agree with Peter that libraries probably should be leading the way on this, just because, if we do share these ideas and kind of make a united front, we're just more likely to be successful with it. But it is worth pointing out, as Sally said earlier, BMJ proved that we don't have, like, it's possible for it to happen without that pressure. So even though libraries probably should be leading it, BMJ has proved that they don't have to. Like, it can be on the publisher's side. There doesn't need to be this pressure from outside for them to do this.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to wrap it up now because I think our time is up. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Phil. I think education is going to be a key part. I hope OpenAthens, the one voice that was missing from this conversation, of course, was the IT teams in the institutions as well, and how they collate and manage identity data within themselves, within those organisations. So that's something that needs to be aware of. But yeah, we'll stop there. Thank you, Phil. Or